Welcome to Alberta Conservation Association's Harvest Your Own podcast, the resource for everything hunting, navigating through the field, the butcher shop, and the kitchen. Life is all about great food. Let's get started.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Brad Fenson, an avid outdoor enthusiast who has worked as a freelance journalist, photographer, and public speaker for over 3 decades. I have hunted, fished, and foraged all my life and hope to share my passion for the outdoors. Along the way, I want to encourage everyone to harvest wild proteins and enjoy the satisfaction of providing the next meal for your family. Our goal is to educate, entertain, and inspire individuals to get outdoors and create a connection between food, health, and your future meals. Welcome to Harvest Your Own. Today we have Paul Jones back in studio. You might remember he talked to us about his pronghorn study and the movements of that species across the prairies and provincial boundaries and international boundaries. It's a pretty interesting study. And today we're going to talk about some other work that he's dealing with in southern Alberta and some of the partners that he has. Welcome back, Paul.
Thanks, Brad. Glad to be back.
Yeah, it's funny because we just had another update on social media here about your pronghorn stuff, and I saw that we had an animal that had some pretty significant movement again, and we talked about that study in detail here a couple months back, and generated lots of interest, not only in the species, but I think we're starting to call them pronghorn now instead of antelope. So the information that you shared is always insightful, is the best way to put it.
Oh, that's great. Great to hear. Yeah, I'm glad people are starting to think of them as pronghorns, so that's good.
Right.
Yeah, and then just on another note on that social media, that girl that we just put out today, she's on the move again, so.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like trying to crawl into the mind of a pronghorn to see what they're thinking on a daily basis, what they need for food, water, and shelter, and how they get it, or if there's something better over the next hill.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like we were just talking about, like, because pronghorn aren't that big of an animal. Like she must have one efficient digestive system just to be taking in food and moving around that much.
Yes, yeah, it's interesting to watch, and it's something we can learn from, as you know. Every piece of data that we get is an important part of the puzzle to maybe understand that one individual animal, but pronghorns overall. And they're at the northern edge of their range in Alberta. And we're lucky to have them here. So understanding how their wants and needs for habitat diversity is important.
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and how critical it is for them to be able to move on that landscape.
Yeah. During our last talk, you did mention that as a kid, you were very interested in wildlife and wanted to have a career in wildlife management. And man, I think you ended up there in spades. You get to work on some pretty cool projects, and we talked about the pronghorn, but today we're going to switch gears and talk about another popular prairie species, although they're not just native to the prairie. But let's talk about Alberta mule deer.
Yeah, so just recently, we're partnering on a new project, which I'll get into a little bit later. But yeah, so I've added sort of mule deer to my portfolio, which is great. And like you mentioned, yeah, mule deer are pretty adaptable. They can be found in a diverse number of habitats, not only across Alberta, but also across Western North America. So they kind of range all the way from the coastal islands of Alaska down the Pacific coast, California to southern Mexico, as well as across the northern Great Plains and the Canadian provinces of Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, and even into the Yukon Territory now. They have some populations. So they're actually found in a diverse number of habitats. So if we look at sort of Alberta itself, we've got populations in southern Alberta. So they're commonly found in the grasslands and parklands regions, and they also thrive in urban environments. They're very adaptable there. And then they also go up all the way up to northern Alberta, so regions that offer agricultural lands and dense boreal forests. So these would be kind of areas around the Peace River area. And then they're also found along sort of the mountain area, along the foothills and the forest fringe region. So they're using a mixture of woodland and open spaces, which, it's another habitat that they're able to use.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch them because to me they're a very, people say whitetails are highly adaptable, which they are because they're up above the Arctic Circle now. They're in the hot climates of Texas and Florida. They survive where we have extreme cold winters and lots of snow. But, mule deer from we called it the wide open plains of southern Alberta, where you can watch your dog run away for 10 days, to the steep river valleys in the Peace River country. They seem to do well, even up in the mountains. If you've ever visited the national parks, we see them in Jasper and Banff and places like that, and they seem to thrive. But, are they more adaptable than whitetails, or are, I think they're more native. They've been here longer. I don't know if that's a correct term, saying more native, but they've been here for a longer period of time.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would say they're more adaptable to whitetails, because whitetail expansion came from the U.S. and it just continues to seem to be moving north and north. But certainly they are locally adapted to the habitats that are found around the province. And even into urban settings, like you look at Edmonton, you look at Calgary, certainly Lethbridge. My sister, who lives up in Grand Prairie, sends me photos all the time of mule deer that are basically living right within the city. So they've, kind of adapted to that human presence.
Yes, yeah, they seem to be able to do that, and they seem to be able to survive the types of winters we get here as well. A lot of people look at them and think, oh, they're on the prairie, they're grazers, but they can graze, they can browse, they seem to make a living wherever they are.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, definitely browsers and making a living. And one of the things I noticed here in Lethbridge when I do my runs is you'll find sort of the whitetails are more downright in the river valley, and then the mule deer are more adapted to that rugged country and kind of hang out in the coulee systems on those breaks. So I think that's one of the ways where, they're sort of adapted to the local climate and local conditions.
Yeah. I just recently saw some very, very interesting information that made sense to me. Dr. Margot Pivas did a presentation on meningeal brainworm and said that, it's the brainworm parasite has moved west with the white-tailed deer. And the reason we only have mule deer in the western part of North America is because of that parasite, that they used to be right across North America. But that was quite an alarming piece of information that kind of struck home. It's like, wow, it does make sense. It's interesting to know that they once ranged right across North America. They do very well in Alberta, but they obviously have some challenges that they're going to face here in coming decades and centuries, hopefully.
Yeah, that's an interesting fact that I hadn't heard. So, yeah, but it kind of does make sense, right?
Yeah.
Like, disease can limit where animals are found and where they're not found.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been dealing with chronic wasting disease for years. It impacted our mule deer management, and that has led to a lot of discussion amongst conservationists and hunters and farmers and all the rest of it, big landowners. Is Alberta's mule deer population static, or is it always changing?
I think naturally it would vary from year to year. Depending on some of the winter climates and winter conditions we have, right? They'll have some die-offs during severe winters and, better survival and recruitment during milder winters. So I think there's always been fluctuations. But I did look at the sort of 2025 sort of status of mule deer across the range, so across North America. And I looked at, the Alberta population estimate. So I think this number is actually for 2024, not 2025, but they estimate a population roughly of 150,000 in Alberta. And they consider it, the provincial government, that it's sort of has a 3-year been decreasing in numbers. And I did have sort of looked at some of the other numbers. So 2021, it was estimated at 193,000, and 2022, 190,300. So yeah, so I think, it kind of varies, but some of that kind of goes with, I always put an asterisk on it, because it also depends on, how many WMUs the provincial government was able to fly and actually get a population estimate on any one given year.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's kind of driven, right, by, dollars, because it's very expensive to fly surveys. So, yeah, they can only fly so many.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I see in some of the states and some of the islands where there's populations, they're now using drones for a fraction of the price to go up and identify the wildlife species and count them from the air, which is pretty, maybe it's the way of the future. We'll have to see what happens with that.
Yeah, changing technology, right?
Yeah.
It's advancing, and people's trying to think about how they can use that technology to, kind of get the same results that you would, let's say, from an aerial ungulate survey.
Yeah. Mule deer populations actually fluctuate a lot because of hunting pressure as well. We've been dealing with chronic wasting disease for over 2 decades now, and part of the control was, hunting. And That type of management, I believe, is also changing, so we could see the populations coming back up as hunting pressure is reduced. But mule deer are a bit more susceptible to hunting pressure because they don't have the same productive ability as a whitetail.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think like whitetails are typically, they can twin quite often, whereas I don't think mule deer can. I think they're more single animals.
Right, and whitetails their fawns breed at 6 months of age, the does, where a mule deer has to be a year and a half before they're bred before they have their first fawn. So it's a year later in terms of getting into the productive state.
Yeah, that's an interesting fact.
This podcast is produced for Harvest Your Own, a program dedicated to those who want to reconnect with food and health through their experiences outdoors. HarvestYourOwn.ca is a resource for individuals to learn more about hunting and the outdoors. There's information to get you started and ensure that your compass stays pointed in the right direction to be successful. Where's your next meal coming from?
What are populations like across North America? Are they also fluctuating? Do we know?
Yeah, so they have been fluctuating, for sure. So there's an organization called the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, so WAFA. And they actually, even back in 1997, initiated a mule deer working group because of concerns about long-term declines in mule deer numbers. So WAFA is actually an association of all of the fish and wildlife agencies, the government agencies from across Western North America. So they kind of got together and got the experts together way back in 1997 to look at mule deer and the concerns of potentially declining populations. So I think if you look long-term, there is declines. I haven't been able to find actual numbers to quantify what that decline is, but I think, when you see fluctuations in populations and you start looking long-term, I think that's where they're thinking that, populations might be declining.
Right.
And then, their key work and focus is trying to improve sort of mule deer populations as well as black-tailed deer, and then also their habitat throughout North America.
Right.
And then sort of providing research and management information to stakeholders to foster collaboration.
Yeah, it's interesting. We got species like caribou and even snowshoe hare, rough grouse that a lot of people say cycle in population. Not everyone believes that, but there's lots of research goes into it to look at it. Maybe that's something we need to say about mule deer. Is there enough research to understand all this stuff?
Yeah, and then that's the thing. I don't know if anyone's actually looked at that, if they're cyclic, or if it's more just driven by cycles in winter conditions. So, if we get severe winters, then knocks populations back, and then they slowly recover. And then if we get another bad winter, they decline again. So I suspect it may be more not cyclic, but more winter condition related.
Yeah, I know that there's certain areas in Alberta where our winters are the limiting factor for them in terms of winter survival and all the rest of it. We've had some bad years. Like 10 years ago, we saw a severe decline in our mule deer and whitetail populations because we had such drastic winters and several that came within a couple of years. So it seems to be Mother Nature's the ultimate control.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's going to kind of be interesting. So I know that Grand Prairie area got a lot of snow in that sort of Christmas holiday period. I think my sister said something like 3 feet of snow. So it's going to be interesting this coming spring, what the number of fawns that are recorded up in that area and survival rates, given that amount of snow.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was up there looking for antlerless elk, and parts of those regions have zero snow. It melted out with Chinooks, but there's others that have over 3 feet of snow on the level, and the drifts are right up over stop signs on some of the roads. To me, it's interesting to watch what happens because we never used to have elk in there, but the elk have created trails and pawed out areas, and the deer seem to be following them pretty hard this winter. But I know that all the deer populations up there don't have an elk herd to follow. But the good news is it's not so widespread that it's a whole region. I think that there's it's the snowpack is so interchangeable on the landscape that there'll always be populations after this winter to help fill in those voids.
Yeah, and it's amazing how those snow patterns drive movements. Like, she's seeing more and more moose right in the city of Grand Prairie than she has in previous years.
Yeah, I've seen that on Facebook every day. Someone's posting about a different moose on this avenue or this street. Watch out for it.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that's just in response to the snow conditions and trying to avoid it by going into, the city and using, people as refuge from predators.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all interesting to watch. We had another guest on the show here a couple months back, Dace Rhodes, and he talked about a moose hunt he had in his career with Alberta Conservation Association. One of the projects that he mentioned that he felt very fortunate to be working on was the mule deer study. Is this a new study or recently launched in recent years?
Yeah, so this is a brand new study that's just been launched basically 2024, 2025, and it's actually called the Alberta Mule Deer Collaring Project. And it's a partnership between Alberta Conservation Association, the Alberta Professional Outfitters Society, the Government of Alberta, both the Ministry of Forestry and Parks and the Ministry of Environment and Protected Areas, and then Wilderness Solutions Inc. and EcoBorealis Consulting. And then basically the funding is coming from Alberta Conservation Association and APOS, the outfitters, with in-kind support from the government, and it's also being sponsored by Grand Slam Club, the Ovis of Canada. So basically the idea is to start collaring mule deer and, determining a number of factors, including survival and movement, habitat selection in the province. So first set of collars went out in January of 2025, and we just finished the second round in January 2026.
Interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about the collars? What kind of information you get, how you do that, how many animals?
Yeah, no, for sure. So again, we're using net gunning professional helicopter companies to capture the deer, to put these collars on. And we're using most of them the first year were all low-tech collars. And then now we're sort of switching up and have gone with a new company. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I can find that out here in a second, Brad.
Yeah, no worries.
So the idea is to try capture both males and females, which is a little bit different than the pronghorn study to date. And we have two main study areas. The first one is in the southeast part of Alberta. So if you think about it, sort of Medicine Hat, Highway 1 south to the Montana border, kind of that Manyberries area, and it covers WMUs 102, 104, 116, 118, and 119. And then the second study area is the southwest Alberta, so kind of to the west of Highway 2, that Claresholm area, and also along Highway 3 in the Pincher Creek area. And it covers WMU 110, 304, 305, 306, and 308. So these are the two actual active study areas right now where we've done captures in the 2 years. And then down the road, we're hoping in 2026, 2027 to add another 2 study areas potentially, but it'll all be, funding dependent. But one would be in that east central Alberta area, so kind of the Wainwright area, and then one up north in the Peace River area.
Oh, wow.
So just to give folks an idea in terms of the number of captures we've done. So our first set of captures in January 2025, we captured 62 animals in the southeast, which was comprised of 52 females and 10 males. And then we did 50 mule deer in the southwest, which was 40 females and 10 males. And then this past January, during our second year of captures, we did 76 animals in the southeast, so 55 females and 21 males. And then 73 were captured in the southwest, 51 females and 22 males. And some of the increase in numbers is we did actually redeploy a few of the collars from mortalities during the first year.
Oh, wow. That's pretty significant. You list off the WMUs, it doesn't sound like a lot, but if you look at a map, it's a huge part of Alberta that you're studying.
Yeah, it's two sort of significantly large study areas in the south right now. And then, eventually, hopefully moving north. So, we try to, as best we can, distribute the collars throughout those different WMUs.
Right. It sounds like you got lots of funding partners, which is good because it tells us that there's lots of interest and lots of concern about the species. Is it Alberta Conservation Association itself that is spearheading the initiative?
We're part of there's a provincial steering committee that ACA as well as APOS and the government sit on. And then underneath that, they're supported by a sort of scientific committee that helps provide guidance on study design and that kind of stuff. So it's sort of ACA is one of the leads at the table for sure.
Right. Interesting. Tell us, are the collars colored? Can people identify them if they're in those areas of the province and they want to get their binoculars out and see if they can actually see one of the animals that's providing data?
Yeah, so they're a little bit different than our pronghorn collars, where they were sort of the banding on the collar was just a brown tan color. These ones actually, the first year, they had orange for females and white for the males as the color banding, and then this year I know they've gone with a green color. I've seen those ones so far. So yeah, you can. They are colored coded the collars, so people can. They're easier to see and easier to find.
Right.
This podcast was made possible by Alberta Conservation Association and the Harvest Your Own community. If you're interested in harvesting your own food, there's a comprehensive collection of information to gain insight and knowledge. Head to the field, harvest your own protein, prepare it, and taste the results. HarvestYourOwn.ca is a library of information from getting started and geared up to processing, butchering, and cooking wild game to make the connection between health and food.
Let's get down into the weeds of it. What are the objectives of the study? What do you want to find out about the mule deer?
Yeah, so we have basically 5 sort of main objectives. The first 2 are kind of related to each other, and that's looking at survivorship and causes of mortality. So our first objective is to sort of evaluate adult female survival and determine cause of mortalities, and we're kind of thinking why we sort of have 2 different study areas is you have different predator compositions between those study areas. So, the southeast will predominantly be cougars and humans, and potentially cougars as well. And then if you go out to our southwest study area where we have, coyotes, cougars, humans, wolves, black bears, grizzly bears, wolverine, lynx, and bobcats. So yeah, seeing if there's differences in survival rate based on the area that they find. And then you're also going to see, differences in winter conditions and snow conditions. So also looking at using like a winter severity index to assess if that has an impact on survivorship between the 2 study areas.
Oh.
And then the same is sort of for the second objective, but instead it's looking at male survivalship because we are able to collar males. And again, looking at is survivalship, lower out west where you have more predators compared to out east. Our third objective is to sort of evaluate efficient population monitoring methods using composition surveys. So here we're going to we haven't started this yet, but kind of looking at, is there alternative ways to inventory mule deer and get, population estimate and also, sex and age compositions using alternative methods for aerial ungulate surveys. So, as you kind of mentioned earlier, advances in drones, could that be a source of way of collecting data to get this information? Looking at some of the satellite imagery, so infrared or thermal, as possible ways to detect mule deer and get those data we need. Or simple things as trail cameras and also maybe road-based surveys. So, yeah, this is kind of some of the things, over the next little while, the team will be getting together and discussing of, which may be a way of collecting the data that we need, and then sort of evaluating that and seeing how efficient they are.
Oh,
and then our fourth objective is really to look at, seasonal movements and migration metrics, as well as habitat preferences on a seasonal basis. And that's, one of the things that really interests me, and it sort of speaks to my background. So we'll be looking at that and looking at movement patterns between the 2 different areas. Are animals migratory or not in those areas? Do they follow spring green up and move to higher elevations in the spring, and then in the fall move down when the snow comes? So these are, some of the things that we'll be looking at as well. And then the last one is to evaluate body condition using ingesta-free body fat. So during captures, they actually have a portable ultrasound machine where they're measuring body fat along the animal's rump, and then looking at that and how that correlates to survival as well.
That's pretty cool stuff. Who'd ever thought we'd be using ultrasound on mule deer to figure out what their physical conditioning is during handling?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. And they've been doing this for a while in Utah, and that's, this study has been using the Utah model as kind of a basis for the study design. And yeah, they've been, using the ultrasound for years on on their mule deer that they capture.
Yeah, I find that the data that we get from these collars is so interesting. Like I said, with the pronghorns being able to follow individuals is really interesting. But I also follow some of the sites for Wyoming where they've collared mule deer, and their population has some huge migration every year. You know, they've got some female mule deer that move hundreds of miles back and forth between different ranges for summer and winter.
Yeah, no, exactly. And, some of their migrations, they're basically all of the animals are following the same pathway. Like, it's amazing how narrow their migration corridors are. But even just after this first year and getting, looking at some of the spring migrations that we saw this year, it's, the mule deer that we're getting are acting kind of like our pronghorn, and they're doing their own thing. So we've had some animals that, kind of were collared sort of west of Claresholm that have in the spring moved west and kind of are already now on the west side of Highway 40. That's in the Crow's Nest Pass that runs north-south. So, they went through some rugged terrain to get into those areas.
Yeah.
And then moving back in the fall. It includes even some of the animals going, what we consider kind of going over the rocks, so getting right up into that alpine and then going over the mountains instead of going around.
Yeah, the thing about mule deer is they're very adaptable and they're very agile. They can handle that type of terrain, almost like, not like a sheep, but they're up in sheep country.
Yeah, no, exactly. I remember when my career was first starting, I kind of volunteered on the Carr Ridge Mountain Goat Project north of Grand Cache there, and I remember seeing both a moose and a mule deer show up on top of the ridge.
Wow. In
the alpine. Yeah, and I think they're just kind of coming up and over, exploring, and then going back down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's obviously showing us a lot already. Can we expect some social media and information on the mule deer study like we've seen on pronghorn?
Yeah, so we actually have right now, it's a standalone website for the project. It's www.albertacollaringproject.com. So yeah, it's kind of up and it's running now. And yeah, updates will be posted there. And then now we've just kind of getting into some of the discussions about doing some more social media posts for the project. So yeah, I think people can certainly stay tuned going to the website about happenings that are happening with the project.
Oh, very good. The collars are expensive. We discussed that with pronghorn. They cost a lot of money. Obviously, you deployed some over the last 2 years. You've got plans coming up. What is the completion date, or what's the length of this project? Is it going to be the length of the collars, or are we going to extend this if we need to or can?
I think, as the results come in, we'll see what the results are saying and whether we need to extend the project or not. And it'll also come down to funding too, and what funding is available. Like you mentioned, collars are expensive. They're, somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 a piece. And then there's the data fees on top of it. So yeah, I mean, as with most studies, it'll become funding is usually the limitation, right?
Right.
But I mean, ideally, you would like to continue on with a long-term study so that you don't just get a snapshot of what's happening, but can see what's happening long-term.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see that type of data in populations where we do experience a bad winter that happens once every 10 to 20 years instead of just, the regular winters. It's data that would help us manage them and understand more about the species, how they can adapt and what they do in those the worst conditions, basically, the ones that are most limiting to their survival. So long-term.
Yeah, exactly.
Long-term is interesting. It's always interesting because we work with different conservation groups, hunting groups, even businesses. Lots of times they ask, how can we get involved? What can we help with? Is it possible for individuals or people or groups or conservation organizations to sponsor collars?
I believe so. I'm just going to check the website, but I think there's actually an option that sort of, if you go to the website, it says, how can you get involved?
Ah, right.
Yeah. And there's, a couple of just initiatives. One is, helping out potentially with, supporting the funding that goes to collaring animals.
Right.
So donating, and I know ACA will accept donations for the project. And then also, for landowners, they're participating by, granting us access during captures,
right,
so that we can get onto their property to capture an animal for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a critical part of it that we often overlook, but our landowners are the reason we have good habitat left out there in many cases as well.
Yeah, exactly. And they're out there and, they see. I know we've had one landowner that has mentioned he's seen a couple of our collared mule deer on his property already. So, and then just, giving us that feedback that, I'm seeing them around.
You create the awareness and people start paying more attention to them. So I think that's a benefit to mule deer overall in Alberta. As we generate more interest and excitement about them, I wouldn't be surprised if people go for a drive. Let's see if we can find a mule deer with a collar. We're going to see a green one, a white one, or orange. It's interesting for how the general public want to get involved and be weekend biologists, so to speak.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think like for mule deer, it's one of the understudied species really in the province. Like since my career, I'm aware of sort of one other major undertaking on mule deer, and that was the work, done at Avi Merrill's lab at the U of A back starting in the early 2000s, looking at CWD and how, things spread throughout the province. So, and then our study now. So, yeah.
It might be a little bit overdue, but we're glad that you're working on this. Any interesting findings to date, something that sticks out that people would want to hear about?
Yeah, I think, like I was mentioning, some of the movements that we're starting to see, out the ones out west, like kind of going up and over the rock and heading to the west during the spring, but even seeing migrations, in the animals that are out in the southeast. So one of the things we found is sort of some of the animals in the springtime kind of moved up in elevation into the Cypress Hills area and then sort of moving out in the fall. And then also, last winter down that southeast country, we had a fair amount of snow, and at times we'd see them, moving more to the rugged terrain, so along the breaks of the Milk River during those snow events and sort of wintering in those areas and then moving back out into the more, I think you can kind of say they're somewhat flatter habitat.
Right. Well, it's good to see they're so adaptable, and I wonder if it's a learned behavior from the females or if they just instinctively know where to move and what to do when those challenges arise.
Yeah, I think, as time goes on and we get multiple year data on the same individuals, we'll, kind of have an idea in terms of what makes them move and what doesn't.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. We're glad that you're out there doing all these studies, whether it's pronghorn, mule deer, and the other things that you're working on, because I know it's pretty diverse. Some of these projects you think would consume one person's time entirely, but obviously you've got your plate full. But I have a feeling you love doing it as well.
Oh, certainly, yeah. It's a passion. Definitely, love and kind of, always saw myself as an angular biologist, but and it's not just me, right? It's a team of people that make this work happen. Yeah,
absolutely. The other biologists that I've talked to from ACA that are working on the study are excited about it and glad that they're being able to participate. So it's good to see the excitement around mule deer. They're a native species to Alberta that has a lot of value in many different ways. And I think understanding them and knowing more about them is probably critical moving forward, especially with all the challenges they have.
Yep, no, for sure. And I think as the data starts coming in, it'll definitely feed into, the provincial government's management of the species. Yeah. Getting a better understanding of what's happening in these two areas.
Right. And then expand it in the future as well. You said you're going to move to other regions as well. So that's it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, exactly. One of the reasons sort of for that is then we'll have kind of a diverse study areas with different levels of CWD, and then kind of trying to get an understanding of, the actual impact that CWD is having on mule deer.
Yeah, and to me, it was like understanding more about the different habitat types and how they support the animal. So obviously, it's going to be multifaceted in terms of the results and what we learn about the animal and how they adapt to everything from disease to habitat to winter to hunting pressure to predators and everything else.
Yep, no, exactly. And it's going to be interesting results for sure.
Yeah. Well, we're going to keep in touch, both with the pronghorns and the mule deer and anything else that you're working on. But I want to thank you for sharing your passion and your knowledge. It's pretty outstanding that we have people dedicated to our ungulates in Alberta and that we're getting an opportunity to learn more about them.
Sounds good. It's been a pleasure, Brad.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. We hope to inspire people to reconnect with nature and appreciate where your food comes from by harvesting your own. For more information on getting started or to learn specifics about the Field to Fork experience, visit harvestyourown.ca and follow on Facebook and Instagram. Check back often for new material, recipes, and videos that are posted regularly. Please subscribe to Harvest Your Own podcast and take the time to rate and review the show to help us build a dedicated core of passionate hunters as our regular audience. Until next time, embrace the outdoors and all it has to offer. Thanks for joining us.